Good evening, I'm Josh Albertus in for Lauren Baker. We want to get straight to the news breaking earlier today. Former President Jimmy Carter has passed away at the age of 100. Carter held a number of different titles during his lifetime, from former president to renowned humanitarian. But one thing that may surprise people was his incredibly close friendship with his predecessor, President Gerald Ford. Their friendship and Ford's roots here in Grand Rapids gave the city a special hold in Carter's heart, he once said. Now we're taking a look back on that friendship through the eyes of experts who knew it best and through what President Carter himself had to say to 13 on Your Side's Juliet Drakus a decade ago.
Grand Rapids has a special hold on my heart because I think the finest public servant I've ever known came from Grand Rapids. Gerald Ford.
Well, first of all, it was the most improbable friendship. I don't think anyone at the end of the 76 campaign would have predicted that they would be friends, much less really very close friends, in the sense that the historical parallel is John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who late in life reconciled after having had a political falling out.
There never has been two former presidents in history, according to the historians, not just me, that were closer personal friends than Gerald Ford and me. I remember about 6 months before he passed away, I got a call from him. I got a lot of telephone calls from him, and he said, "My friend Jimmy, how you doing today?" And I said, "Fine." He said, "I want to ask a favor of you." And I said, "You can ask anything you want to, Jerry, and I'll do it, I'm sure." He said, "I want you to give the eulogy at my funeral." And I was really taken aback. I didn't know what to say. And I finally said, "Okay, I'll promise to give yours if you'll give mine if I pass away first." So we had a deal. So I was very honored to come here, for his funeral and give the main eulogy. And as a matter of fact, Rosa and Betty were very close friends too. And at Betty's funeral recently, Rosa gave the eulogy in California.
President Ford and Governor Carter did not know each other prior to the 1976 presidential campaign. That was a hard-fought campaign in '76. President Ford had issued a pardon to President Nixon, his predecessor, and it really took a toll on President Ford's popularity. So he starts out the race in 1976, basically 30 points behind Governor Carter. He's got to make up 30 points. That means he's got to slug it out. He's got to draw clear distinctions with his opponent. Governor Carter, for his part, also wants to take advantage of the fact that President Ford is not particularly popular as an incumbent. But over the course of 1976, President Ford claws and scraps his way back and is able to make it a competitive race. He comes within 1 to 2 points, actually, of winning in November of '76. But in the process, of course, these candidates are drawing distinctions between each other. And when President Ford makes a mistake of saying that there's no Soviet domination of Poland, for example, in one of the debates.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
President Carter and his team pounced on that. Does President Ford not realize what's going on behind the Iron Curtain?
And I would like to see Mr. Ford convince the Polish Americans and the Czech Americans and the Hungarian Americans in this country that those countries don't live under the domination and supervision of the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain.
People forget how close the '76 election was. If 11,000 votes had changed in 2 states, Ford would have been president. But he never thought about, contesting the outcome. I'll leave it at that.
President Ford was a man of great integrity, so they match each other well in the campaign, because President Ford, even though it was considered a mistake in judgment to pardon his predecessor, President Nixon, President Ford also was not a liar. He was a man of great character. And this is going to be the basis of their later friendship. Both men have a tremendously strong character.
It's interesting. The morning after the election, Joe Garagiola, who had been staying at the White House and who had worked in the campaign with Ford, he walked into the Oval Office, burst into tears, and Ford's consoling him, and saying, "Listen, there are more important things, in the world than what's going to happen to Jerry Ford." And he said something very revealing. He said, without naming Carter, he said, "I've got to turn the White House over to him in better shape than I found it." And that is a key, I think. he felt an obligation. Someone who never expected to be president, never aspired to be president, had this profound kind of sense of almost an obligation to history and certainly to the country to have a smooth transition.
I think the tone for reconciliation of these two men, these two fierce competitors, occurred already at the inaugural address that Jimmy Carter gave on January 20th, 1977. Because now newly elected and sworn in, President Carter starts that address by saying, before I say anything else, I want to stop and say thank you to outgoing President Gerald Ford for all he did to heal our land. Oh my gosh, this really sets the tone now for friendship and reconciliation to occur. So they went from, you can see what happens here, they start out never as enemies. President Ford and President Carter did not look at political opponents as enemies. They were opponents, but they were not enemies. They were Americans. There was more that united them than divided them. So President Ford basically, went from his attitude toward Jimmy Carter from being an opponent, a political opponent, to now a civic friend. Not a personal friend yet, but a civic friend.
During the interregnum between the election and the inauguration, Carter came and spent time at the White House with Ford. And Ford thought it was just going to be a courtesy call, but in fact, they spent 90 minutes talking about foreign policy.
Now, President Ford and President Carter are going to scrap and claw again in the 1980 election because President Ford is still a Republican and President Carter is now running for re-election. Ronald Reagan, though, is the guy who's going to win that election. And of course, President Ford wants to support the Republican and not the Democrat. But once they get through the campaign of 1980, President Reagan is now in office. An issue comes up when Anwar Sadat is assassinated in October, the fall of 1981.
It's an occasion of more than ceremonial mourning for Ford and Carter. They both feel a real personal sense of loss. And Ronald Reagan, who was just recovering still from an assassination attempt that spring, there was no question of his going. And so in his stead, they sent the three living former presidents.
President Reagan makes available the plane to go over to carry Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter, three former presidents, all of whom had worked on Middle Eastern peace. And it was on that flight that Jimmy Carter and President Ford started to bond, to move beyond just being civic friends to now more of personal friends.
What did your friendship entail? Did you see each other? Did you do things together?
Jerry and I, when we were in a car riding somewhere, we always hated to get where we were going because, we ordinarily had big events. When you get two presidents together, there's generally a crowd when you arrive, so we always wanted to be by ourselves. And when I was just getting the Carter Center started, he was one of my most frequent guests to come to the Carter Center and participate because it's a bipartisan operation. And I came out here to his library several times as well to participate in programs in which he had a great interest. So we just, as I said, our wives are friends, our children knew each other, and it was just a close-knit family friendship.
What is one of your favorite memories about Gerald Ford?
Well, I think the gentleness with which he ran against me. As a matter of fact, when I ran against him and he was the incumbent president, you know how much money he and I raised for the general election? Zero.
Zero.
We didn't raise a single penny because we just took the $2 per person checkoff on your income tax, and that's all that we spent. And so we never would have dreamed about having a negative television commercial, criticizing the other person. And after the election was over, we were on a reviewing stand together, and my first thing I said in my inaugural speech was, we want to express our deep, great gratefulness to Gerald Ford for healing our nation.